It happened on a sunlit afternoon in Dakar, Senegal. Cameras were rolling. Security was tight. The African Youth Leadership Summit had just concluded, and the crowd was beginning to thin out. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a sleek black car pulled up near the red carpet reserved for international dignitaries. The door opened. A tall, silver-haired man stepped out, his presence immediately commanding attention. It was Richard Lawson, the retired Hollywood icon. Once the face of American cinema, he hadn't been seen in public for nearly 7 years. No one knew why he came. No press, no entourage. Just him. Then it happened. In front of the world, Richard dropped to his knees before Ibrahim Traoré. Silence. No clapping. No cheering. Just gasps. Even Traoré looked momentarily stunned. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists stopped breathing. Security took a step forward but froze on command. Then, Traoré slowly leaned down. His hand rested gently on Richard's shoulder. He whispered something. Just one sentence. Richard trembled. His eyes filled with tears. And the world changed forever in that moment. But what did Traoré say? And why would a man worshipped in the West kneel before the leader of a small African nation? You won't believe what comes next. Before his fall into silence, Richard Lawson had it all. Oscars, wealth, and fame. In the 90s, his face sold out theaters worldwide. But behind the glamour, he carried a secret. In 2001, during a UNICEF Goodwill tour in West Africa, Richard had visited a small Burkinabe village. A boy named Issoufou had run to him with a handmade drawing, an image of Africa rising. Richard smiled, took the drawing, but never gave it another thought. That night, the village was raided by mercenaries. The boy, Issoufou, was one of the many who vanished. Richard had always felt that his presence, his spotlight, might have drawn danger to that place. He never spoke of it, but it haunted him for 2 decades. He stopped acting. He disappeared from Hollywood. Until one night in 2023, he was watching a news segment on Burkina Faso. There stood a young leader, firm, clear-eyed, brave. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. And on his desk, during a televised interview, Richard saw it. A faded drawing, the same one Issoufou had given him in 2001. It couldn't be. Or could it? Richard booked a flight to Dakar that night. He had to kneel. He had to ask for forgiveness. But Traoré's response was not what he expected. Traoré bent close, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd held its breath. He said just one sentence to Richard. The boy you carry in your guilt now lives in the strength of us all. Richard's knees buckled, not from pain, but from release. Tears poured down his face. In front of cameras and presidents, this man who had once stood above kings now wept like a child. And Traoré, steadfast and calm, lifted him up hand to hand. That moment wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't staged, it was truth. Raw, healing, unfiltered. Reporters scrambled to understand what had happened. Speculations flew. Was this a PR stunt, a political alliance, or something more mysterious? But for the thousands watching live, and the millions who would see it later on YouTube, TikTok, and TV, it felt different. Something ancient, sacred. Traoré didn't speak again for the rest of the event. He simply walked beside Richard to the exit. That one sentence would echo through continents, but behind that sentence was a story even deeper, one that would link Ibrahim Traoré, Issoufou, and Richard Lawson in ways no one was ready for. And now, you're going to hear it. But prepare yourself, because what happened next will leave you in tears. 3 hours after the summit, a video clip of Richard Lawson kneeling went viral. Within minutes, hashtags like Traoré moment and Hollywood kneels were trending in over 30 countries. But there was one face missing from the coverage. a quiet man watching from a phone shop in Ouagadougou. His name was Isufu Ouedraogo, a local teacher, a father, and a survivor. When the clip showed Richard kneeling, Isufu froze. He knew that man, not from the movies, but from a haunting memory. It was him. The same man who had once smiled at him and taken his drawing, then disappeared just before his village burned. But Isufu didn't feel hatred. He felt peace. There was something in Richard's face, something honest, something broken. Isufu called his wife and simply said, "It's him, the man from that night. And now he's kneeling before the one who made me whole again." His wife didn't reply. She was already crying. The story, it seemed, was deeper than anyone knew. But for the first time in 22 years, Isufu felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Closure. And now, the world was about to learn why. That night, under the dim light of a Dakar hotel room, Richard Lawson recorded a voice message on his phone. It wasn't for Hollywood. It wasn't for the media. It was for one man only. He sent it to Ibrahim Traoré privately. "I don't know if you remember the drawing," Richard said, his voice trembling. "But I kept it. It was found later in a UNICEF storage crate, sealed in plastic. I never knew the boy's name, but that night broke something in me." He paused, breathing deeply. "I quit everything after that. Acting felt fake. Fame felt disgusting. The world celebrated me while a village cried because I existed." He sighed. "Then I saw you, Traoré. I saw the way you spoke, the way you didn't just lead. You lifted. And that's when I knew. I had to come. I had to kneel, not to a president, but to a man who carries nations in his eyes." He ended the recording with 3 words: "I am sorry." That message would never be made public. But what Traoré did next would make headlines across every major news outlet. And it all began with a handwritten letter. The next morning, a sealed white envelope arrived at Richard's hotel room. It had no stamp, no label, just one thing written across the front in fine, clean handwriting: "To the man who remembers." Richard opened it with shaky hands. Inside was a letter, but it wasn't typed. It was written in blue ink. Neat, personal, every word chosen with care. "You don't kneel before me," it read. "You kneel before the memory of what was broken, and in doing so you help mend what still bleeds." It was signed, IT. But something else was inside. It was a photo, a recent one. In it, a man stood in front of a blackboard, teaching a room full of barefoot children. He was smiling. The caption read, "Isufu Ouedraogo, educator, survivor, father." Tears slid down Richard's cheeks. The boy was alive. He had grown into hope. At that moment, Richard knew this story wasn't about him anymore. It never was. It was about a leader who carried the pain of a people and turned it into purpose. And the world was finally ready to listen. In 2001, the village of Dano in southwestern Burkina Faso was nothing more than clay huts and courage. One afternoon, a 9-year-old boy named Isufu ran barefoot toward a foreign car parked near the well. He had drawn something on an old rice sack, a mountain with people holding hands at the top. Beneath it, he wrote, "Africa will rise." He handed it to the white man with cameras. That man was Richard Lawson. Isufu never forgot his smile, nor how the man whispered, "This is beautiful." But hours later, gunshots echoed through the trees. Rebels stormed the village. His mother pushed him under the bed and told him not to move, no matter what. He never saw her again. He walked for 2 days before collapsing near a missionary school. He was taken in, raised by teachers, and taught the power of silence, strength, and survival. And yet, for all the years that followed, one thing never left his heart: the image of a man taking his drawing and walking away. Isufu never hated him, but he never expected to see that man again. Until now. And never like this. Kneeling, shaking, as if the past had come to beg for peace. Days after the public kneeling, with the world still in a frenzy, Ibrahim Traoré made a quiet, unannounced visit to a local school in Ouagadougou. There were no cameras, no bodyguards, just a folded envelope in his coat pocket and a name on his mind. Isufu Ouedraogo. Traoré entered the school, greeted the headmaster, and asked for the man who taught the evening classes. He waited. When Isufu entered the room and saw Traoré standing there, his breath caught in his chest. He had seen the face on television, but standing before him now was a man not of fame, but of gravity. "I knew about you," Traoré said gently, long before the cameras. Isufu's eyes welled up. "I kept your drawing. It traveled farther than you know." Traoré handed him the envelope. Inside was a ticket, first class to Geneva. It read, "Come speak with me. The world must hear from the ones who were never heard." Isufu said nothing. He just nodded, and for the first time since that night in Dano, he cried, not from pain, but from being seen. The leader had remembered the forgotten, and that changed everything. It was cold in Geneva. Snow drifted gently against the windows of the UN Assembly Hall, where world leaders had gathered for the African Sovereignty Conference, a historic summit led by Ibrahim Traoré. The surprise guest was announced: Isufu Ouedraogo, educator, survivor, Burkinabe. He walked onto the stage in a plain white shirt and dusty shoes, untouched by politics or fashion. And then, something incredible happened. Richard Lawson entered from the opposite side. Two worlds collided: an actor whose face once filled theaters, a teacher whose voice had never been heard beyond a village. They looked at each other, and without a script, without rehearsal, Richard knelt again. But this time Isufu lifted him up. He took the microphone and said, "We do not need the world's pity. We need its ears." The room was silent. Ibrahim Traoré rose from his seat and added just one line: "Africa is not your stage, it is your mirror." The crowd erupted in applause, but some wept openly. In that room, centuries of silence cracked open like thunder. It was not just about forgiveness anymore, it was about recognition, and the world was finally starting to listen. Backstage in Geneva, after the emotional moment between Isufu and Richard, over 24 journalists gathered, ready to break the story. These were not just any reporters, they were from CNN, BBC, Reuters, and Al Jazeera. But something was wrong. For the first time in their careers, they couldn't find the words. A BBC correspondent quietly turned off her mic and said, This isn't just news. This is history happening in front of us." A CNN anchor simply sat, eyes wet. "I've reported on 5 wars, 2 presidential assassinations and climate disasters, but I've never felt this heavy in my chest." They didn't want to twist it into headlines. They didn't want to make it viral. They just wanted to sit in the moment. Why? Because in that quiet, icy hall, they saw something their cameras couldn't frame. A man who didn't come to take over the world, but to heal it. Ibrahim Traoré had shattered expectations, not with weapons, not with fury, but with dignity, clarity, and the power of humility. And suddenly it became clear. This wasn't the climax. This was only the beginning. As the room cleared that night, a single question echoed in private circles, chat rooms, and across every news channel. What did Ibrahim Traoré whisper to Richard when he first knelt in Ouagadougou? There was no clear audio. No mic captured it. But the cameras showed Richard's face change. 1 second, shame. The next, a trembling gasp, as if someone had ripped open time itself. Speculations flew. Some said it was a threat. Others thought it was forgiveness, but neither were true. Days later, Richard himself answered it in a rare interview. Ibrahim leaned in, looked me in the eye, and said, "You don't owe me anything, but you owe the truth to the world." That one sentence, "You owe the truth to the world," was the echo that silenced millions. Because the truth is heavy. And Richard had lived too many years pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen in Dano, in Congo, in South Sudan, on Hollywood-funded documentary trips that used African pain as a backdrop to Western glory. Now Ibrahim wasn't asking for justice. He was asking for honesty. And somehow, that hit deeper. 3 days after the Geneva summit, a package arrived at Ibrahim Traoré's temporary residence in Switzerland. It was old, dusty, wrapped in linen. No name, no sender. Just a note that said, "I kept this all these years. It's time." Inside were 6 mini DV tapes, dates scribbled on the side. Dano, May 2001. Obo, July 2003. Beni, March 2005. It was footage from over 2 decades ago, never aired, never edited. Richard had kept it in a safety box in Los Angeles, and now it was in the hands of a man who had once been a boy hiding under a bed in Dano. Ibrahim sat down that night with Isufu and a translator. Together, they watched the lost reels. They saw laughing children, broken wells, forgotten cries. They saw African mothers feeding film crews before feeding their own. And they saw the boy, Isufu, holding that rice sack drawing, smiling, full of hope. The room was quiet. Traoré turned to Isufu and said, "The world forgot your face, but now they will remember your voice." At that moment, Isufu covered his eyes and wept. It was no longer about revenge. It was about restoring what was taken. The next morning, Ibrahim invited the press, not for a statement, but for a screening. Inside a small hall in Geneva, dozens of journalists, human rights lawyers, and quiet diplomats gathered. A projector hummed. The lights dimmed. Then it began. Footage that was never meant to be seen. An American film crew joking while a young Burkinabe girl fetched water from a muddy hole. A relief scene staged with props where locals were told to look more hungry. Then, the most haunting clip. A boy in tattered shorts, standing near a soldier. Dust swirled. His hands were shaking. "I want to go to school," the boy whispered in French. It was Isufu. In the back of the room, now 31 years old, Isufu collapsed into tears. People in the room were stunned. And Richard? He was in the front row, hands shaking, eyes red. Then Ibrahim stood. He said, "This is not just about one actor. It's about an entire system built on silence." A few journalists left the room, too ashamed to stay. The rest stayed behind, because they knew the world couldn't unsee what it just saw. On March 12, 2025, the largest live broadcast in African media history went online. Over 200 million people tuned in, from Ouagadougou to Los Angeles, from small villages to the halls of the United Nations. At the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré. And beside him, Richard Stone, the former Hollywood icon who once played kings and warriors on screen, now standing beside a real one. No teleprompters, no flashy lights, just truth. Richard took the mic. His voice cracked. "I once thought Africa was a backdrop, but it is the soul of humanity. I was wrong. I profited off pain I never stopped to understand." Then he turned to Ibrahim, and with the world watching said, "Forgive me. Teach me. Let me serve this truth." A silence fell across continents. Ibrahim stepped forward, took his hand, and simply said, "We do not cancel, we restore." That sentence echoed through timelines and newsrooms. Then, without warning, Richard knelt. Again. But this time, it wasn't for forgiveness. It was in solidarity. The live stream chat exploded. Tears, prayers, shaking emojis, flags of every nation. The world wasn't just witnessing change, it was feeling it, in real time. After the broadcast, Ibrahim returned to his hotel. He sat alone, no speeches, no celebrations. He pulled out an old folded paper from his coat pocket. It was worn, faded, a letter, written years ago, to himself. When he was just a 13-year-old boy in Burkina Faso, hiding under the floorboards as gunfire echoed through his village. It read, "If you survive, speak for those who couldn't, not to shame the world, but to remind it what a heart sounds like when it still beats for others." Ibrahim placed the letter on the table beside Isufu. "You don't need to be famous to be historic," he said. "You just need to remember." Isufu wept. They were not actors. They were not stars. They were two boys who made it out alive and came back not with bitterness, but with purpose. At that exact hour, schools in Burkina Faso paused classes. Teachers played the speech. Children clapped. Some cried. In a world full of noise, one voice had cut through. Not to entertain, but to awaken. The next day, an 11-year-old girl in a dusty town near Kaya wrote in her journal, "When I grow up, I want to be like Ibrahim, not rich, just true." As the world replayed the kneeling moment over and over, one woman in Burkina Faso stayed silent. Her name was Mariam. She lived in a small clay house outside of Fada Ngourma. No social media, no electricity, just a radio powered by a hand crank. She turned it on and heard the broadcaster speak. "And today, President Ibrahim Traoré has revealed..." Mariam dropped the pot she was washing. Tears filled her eyes. Because that was her son's name. Ibrahim. The same boy she carried across the desert during famine. The same boy who refused to eat unless his sister was fed first. The same boy who told her at 9 years old, "Maman, one day I will make sure no mother cries alone again." Now the world knew him. But to her, he was still the barefoot child who fixed neighbors' radios for coins. She didn't cry because of pride. She cried because he hadn't forgotten who he was. A government car stopped at her house later that night. A young soldier handed her a phone. "Ibrahim wants to speak to you." She didn't say hello. She whispered, "You kept your promise, my son." And both mother and son wept together. And then, finally, the moment the world had waited for. What did Ibrahim whisper? It was on every headline, every blog, every whisper on the street. But no one had the full footage. Until now. At a press conference attended by leaders from 42 countries, Ibrahim stood with Richard beside him. The tension in the room was so thick you could hear every breath. He played the raw, uncut clip. Richard kneeling. Ibrahim leaning forward. The mic caught it clearly. "You kneel not to me, but to the boy inside you who finally stood up." And in that second, the world froze. It wasn't about shame. It wasn't about submission. It was about rebirth. Because Richard Stone wasn't kneeling in guilt. He was rising into something new. And as the room sat silent, something shifted, deep in the soul of every person watching. One sentence. That was it. But it carried the weight of a century. Old rules cracked. New bridges formed. And for the first time in decades, Africa wasn't asking for permission. It was welcoming those who came with truth, not ego. Days after the event, Richard Stone returned to California, not to act, not to sign autographs, but to speak. In front of a hall of Hollywood's biggest names, he stood and read Ibrahim's final quote aloud. "Africa is not a charity. Africa is a mirror. You either look away or you see who you truly are." The room went still. Some cried, some looked down in shame, but all listened. And back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim was back to work. No parades, no self-congratulations. He visited a rural school, where children sat on dirt floors. He knelt down, not for cameras, but to fix a broken desk with his own hands. And that image went more viral than the kneeling, because real power never shouts, it builds. Dear viewers, if this story moved you, if it made you cry, made you think, or made you proud to be human, please hit the like button so the world sees stories like this more. Drop a comment. What part hit you the hardest? And if you believe in truth, dignity, and leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, subscribe now. We tell the stories others won't. Let's make the world feel again, together.